In the dark, the rain falls silently. When the night falls and the raindrops gradually cover the ground, the sound of them usually brings peace. But not tonight. For those who stay awake at night, it is the sound of something coming, something unpredictable. Between the falling drops and the gentle whistling of the wind through the windows, you can hear strange sounds, perhaps just hallucinations of a tired mind, or perhaps something more sinister. First story, the gatekeeper. John used to be a healthy, optimistic man, but everything changed when he took a job at an old hotel on the edge of town. The job of night gatekeeper seemed simple, but behind the ancient walls of the hotel were secrets that no one wanted to talk about. John felt that every night he stayed, the air grew heavier. He began to see shadows in dark corners, but when he checked, there was no one there. At first, John convinced himself that it was just the dim lighting and his imagination. But when footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, when he heard the door slam, with no one approaching, John knew he could no longer deny it. Something was wrong. Something was watching him, always there, right behind him. One night, he decided to check the basement that the hotel had locked for a long time. By the weak light of his flashlight, he discovered strange marks on the wall. They looked like fingernails scratching into mortar, stretching all the way from the stairs to a secret door he had never seen before. When the door swung open with a screech, John knew he had gone too far. Story 2, the old photo. A young woman, Sarah, discovered an old photo in a drawer while cleaning her new home. The photo showed a group of strangers standing in front of her house. Strangely, the photo looked new, as if it had just been taken, despite the fact that the scene was decades old. Sarah felt a vague sense of dread, but she reassured herself that it was just a prank by the previous owner. However, since discovering the photo, Sarah began to notice strange things happening in the house. Shadows moved across her field of vision, but when she turned around, there was no one. She heard whispers of laughter in the night, but when she checked, there was only darkness and silence. Then one night, Sarah looked at the photo again and saw that one of the people in it had turned to look directly at her. There was no longer the strange smile, no longer the blank gaze. The person was now looking straight at her, as if they were watching her from the photo. Sarah knew that something terrible was coming, but she didn't know how to escape it. Story 3, the window beyond. There was a house in the neighborhood that no one dared to approach. It was said that the people who lived there were always haunted by a terror. The windows of the house were always closed, and no one had ever seen a light from inside. But one rainy night, a young woman decided to explore the house, hoping to find something interesting or to explain the strange stories surrounding it. As she approached the window, she felt something moving behind the curtains. She stopped, but couldn't see clearly. Her footsteps became heavier as she got closer, and then the window opened. A face stared out, but it wasn't a human face. It was something indescribable, something that made her heart stop for a moment. She ran away from the house, but the image of that face haunted her in her dreams every time it started to rain. Story 4, Whispers from the Dark. Since childhood, Mark has been fascinated by the dark. Not in the way a child would be afraid of it, but rather with endless curiosity. He grew up with a passion for learning about the world hidden in dark corners. As a researcher of psychology and the supernatural, Mark began investigating the phenomenon of shadows, which many believe to be spirits or entities not of this world. One night, while working late in the lab, he began to hear soft whispers. At first, Mark thought it was just the wind whistling through the window or the noise of equipment. But these whispers were not normal. They repeated, became clearer, and seemed to be trying to communicate something. Mark listened, trying to distinguish the vague words from the darkness. "Go outside. Don't look. They will come." Those words made his heart pound. Mark stood up, walked closer to the window, and tried to look outside. But what he saw was not the familiar scene of the deserted street under the night lights. Outside, the night seemed to be distorted, a dark fog swirling like a bottomless deep water. From within the fog, dark shadows began to appear. One by one, like invisible entities now willing to reveal themselves. Mark turned around, closing the window tightly, but the whisper was still there, closer and clearer than ever. "They're here." He felt the air in the room thicker, heavier, and a cold air invaded his senses. The dark shadows from the window now crept into the room, slowly surrounding him. Mark gasped, but couldn't move. In that brief moment, he understood that there were secrets in the darkness that should never be discovered. Story 5: The Man by the Road. This story has been told for generations, but no one knows for sure where it began. A stranger, always standing by the road, motionless, just waiting. People called him the Man by the Road, a symbol of loss and despair, but few dared to approach to ask. Jennifer was a person who did not believe in ghost stories. To her, those things were just the products of the imagination of superstitious people. But one night, while driving home on a deserted road, Jennifer saw a man standing silently by the side of the road. He was dressed in old black clothes, his face was haggard, and his eyes were cold. At first, she thought it was just an ordinary pedestrian, but the strange thing was that as she drove by, he did not move, did not look at her. But when Jennifer looked in the rearview mirror, the man was still standing there, right where she had just passed. Unease began to creep in. She felt like something was wrong. Her instincts urged her to turn around, but her mind told her that it was silly. However, as she turned to drive away, the headlights flickered out, and the man was now in front of the car, as if he had never left. Jennifer frantically slammed on the brakes, but when she tried to look back, the man was gone. She didn't dare drive any further, but as she was about to turn and leave the road, she heard a light tap from the other side of the window. She turned her head, and for a moment, her eyes met his cold face, only separated by the thin glass of the car. Amidst the patter of rain, she heard a soft sigh, and before she could react, the man disappeared into the darkness, leaving her with an inexplicable feeling of fear. Story 6: The Haunted Bed. Linda's hunch was right when she bought this old house. From the outside, it looked like just another old house waiting to be renovated. But since moving in, she has been experiencing strange phenomena, especially around the old big bed in the bedroom. Every night, as soon as she lay down on the bed, she felt like there was another presence in the room. At first, it was just a fleeting feeling, but gradually this presence became more obvious. One night, she woke up and felt someone sitting at the end of the bed. But when she looked down, there was no one, only darkness. The incident culminated when Linda decided to find out the history of the house. She discovered that, decades ago, there had been a mysterious case involving the previous owner of the house. His wife had disappeared without a trace, and there were rumors that she had been murdered and her body hidden in that very bed. Linda shivered as she realized that the presence she felt might be the ghost of the woman who had died unjustly, who could not rest in peace. In the following nights, she began to hear quiet sobbing from the corner of the room, and sometimes she could feel cold fingers touching her shoulder. Linda knew that she could no longer stay in this house, but it seemed that every time she prepared to leave, the bed seemed to suck her in, making it impossible for her to escape. Story 7: The Call from the Empty Room. The house Sam moved into was an old mansion with a long history. The previous owners had all left in a hurry, leaving behind many old furniture and items. One of them was a small room in the back, which the previous owners always said should not be entered at night. They did not explain the reason, only that it was something they had always followed from generation to generation. Sam, a skeptic of supernatural phenomena, never believed in ghost stories. He decided not to let that superstition affect him. One evening, while working late at night, he suddenly heard a light knocking sound coming from the empty room in the back. It was too obvious to be imagined. At first, Sam ignored it, thinking it was just the wind or the creaking of the old house. But the knocking became stronger, as if someone was trying to call him. Curiosity made him grab his flashlight and approach the small room. When he opened the door, the room was empty and cold, with nothing but a few old, dusty objects. But as Sam turned to leave, he heard a whisper right next to his ear. Help me. The voice was vague, as if it was echoing from a faraway place, but it was clearly from this room. Sam turned around, trying to find the source of the voice, but the room was still empty. Nothing strange, however. A chill ran down his spine. A few days later, the call continued. It kept repeating, becoming clearer and clearer. Sam decided to find out the mystery of the room. He discovered that, many years ago, a young girl had disappeared in this very house. Her family had been unable to find any trace of her, but there was a theory that she had been locked in a small room in the back and never released. The truth about the girl's death remains a mystery, but Sam understands that her soul is still trapped somewhere in this house, waiting for someone to help. Every night, the call becomes more urgent, as if begging him to find a way to free her. But the more Sam tries, the deeper he sinks into the unsolvable mystery, and in the end, he, like the previous owners, must leave the house with the haunting call from the empty room. Story 8. The Woman in the Mirror. Since childhood, Chloe has heard strange stories about the antique mirror in her grandmother's house. Her grandmother said that the mirror was from the previous century and contained a mysterious power. Many people believe that if you look into a mirror for too long, you will see something you never wanted to face. Chloe never believed in those stories until she received the mirror as an inheritance after her grandmother passed away. At first, the mirror was just an ordinary decoration in Chloe's bedroom. But then, strange things started to happen. On dark nights when she looked into the mirror, she saw a strange figure flash by, just for a moment. It was the image of a woman, with a blurry face and empty eyes, standing looking at her from the mirror. Chloe tried to ignore these phenomena, thinking that it was just her imagination. But the woman's figure appeared more and more frequently. Every time she looked in the mirror, the woman grew closer, as if she were approaching her from within the mirror. One night, while Chloe was looking in the mirror, the woman in the mirror suddenly smiled. It was not a normal smile, but a threatening one, something dark. Chloe panicked and ran out of the room, but when she turned back, the woman had disappeared, and the mirror only reflected her face as usual. As time went on, Chloe felt more and more haunted by the mirror. She began to hear a soft voice calling from within the mirror at night, like a woman's whisper. "Come closer." Chloe tried to resist, but she couldn't stop herself from being drawn to the mirror. One night, she couldn't bear it anymore. Chloe moved closer to the mirror, and in that moment, she realized something terrible. The woman in the mirror was herself, but a version of herself trapped in another world where fear and despair ruled. The figure wanted Chloe to take her place, to be freed from the world in the mirror. In that moment, Chloe found herself sucked into the mirror, and as she tried to escape, the woman's arm reached out from the mirror, pulling her in. Chloe's scream echoed throughout the room, but no one heard her. The next morning, the mirror was left with only one image, a girl standing silently, with empty eyes and a haunting smile forever. Story 9. The Mystery of the House Without Windows. A small village in the suburbs has always had mysterious stories about a house without windows located on the edge of the forest. It is said that the house used to be a shelter for a wealthy family, but after a terrible accident, the entire family disappeared without a trace. Since then, the house has been deserted. No one dares to come near for fear that their souls are still lurking somewhere inside. David, a young photographer, decided to explore the house after hearing too many stories about it. He has always been fascinated by mysterious places and believes that he can find something valuable. One autumn morning, he brought his camera and began his journey to the house. When David entered, the house was completely empty. Not a single bit of light came in because there were no windows. The air was cold and thick, carrying an unpleasant musty smell. His footsteps echoed in the quiet space, and it felt like someone was watching from behind him. David felt a chill run down his spine as he walked deeper into the windowless house. Every step he took echoed like the rhythmic beating of a heart, breaking the deathly silence inside. Everything in the house was old and dusty, as if no one had set foot here for a long time. But something was wrong. It wasn't just the coldness or the darkness. but some invisible feeling, as if something was watching him from every corner. David walked into a long hallway where the walls were lined with empty picture frames. Some of the old pictures were torn, leaving patches of paper on the walls. But what made him shiver were the empty spots on the walls where something had clearly hung, something that had now mysteriously disappeared. Rumors about the family that had lived in the house began to appear in David's mind. The villagers said they had disappeared under strange circumstances, with no trace to be found. Some of the elders said they might have been trapped somewhere between worlds, and that their spirits still lingered around the house, trying to find a way out. David stopped as he entered a larger room at the end of the hallway. The room was completely empty, except for a large mirror in the middle, reflecting his reflection. But strangely, when David stared into the mirror, he saw more than just himself. A shadowy figure appeared behind him, floating in the air. He turned around, but there was no one there. David's heart pounded. There was something in this house, something he couldn't see with his naked eyes. He turned to face the mirror again, but this time the shadow was clearer, as if it were coming closer to him. Suddenly, David's flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. He tried to turn it back on, but it didn't respond. In the absolute darkness, David felt the coldness growing closer and closer to him. Suddenly, a whisper came from behind him, very soft, but enough to make him freeze. "Don't look in the mirror, ... David frantically turned on the flashlight again, and when the light flashed, the mirror was gone, leaving only a black void on the floor. No more shadows, no more reflections of himself, just an eerie emptiness that confused his senses. He knew he had to leave this place immediately. But as he turned to walk out the door, David felt his legs heavy, as if being pulled back by an invisible force. The small whispers gradually turned into faint cries, then into desperate screams that echoed from all directions. This house was no longer a simple abandoned place. It was a place filled with trapped souls, yearning for release. David tried to run as fast as he could, but the hallway seemed endless. The doors he had just passed now slammed shut, each step blocking his way. The banging and screaming grew louder, making his mind spin. Finally, when all hope was lost, David saw the door ahead of him open. Without thinking, he rushed toward it, turned the handle, and threw the door open. But as he stepped over the threshold, everything changed. Instead of the light outside, he saw only another room, a room he had never entered before. Standing in the middle of the room was a man, but not a living one. His face was pale and shadowy, his eyes empty but filled with pain. "You shouldn't have come here," the man whispered, his voice echoing from another world. David wanted to ask, but couldn't form the words. The man looked at him, his deep eyes draining all of David's strength. And then, before David knew it, the room was gone, the house was gone, and he found himself standing in the middle of the jungle, with no sign of the windowless house he had just entered. But David knew that he had never truly left the house. The whispers and shadows that lingered in his mind reminded him that the house was still watching him, waiting for him to return one day, or perhaps he had never left it at all. After escaping from the windowless house, David still couldn't shake the creepy feeling that was enveloping him. Everything around him became unusually quiet. The forest he was standing in now had no sound of wind, no more insects or animals, only an eerie dead silence. David tried to calm down, breathing slowly and evenly, but he couldn't stop thinking about the image of the mysterious man in the last room. The man's pale face and empty eyes kept appearing in his mind, like a warning that David couldn't understand. He decided to find a way out of the forest, but each step seemed to take him deeper into the darkness. The familiar path he thought he would easily find had disappeared, replaced by winding and twisting paths that he had never been through before. The more he walked, the more he felt like he was trapped in a maze with no way out. Suddenly, a small sound rang out from behind. David turned around, but there was nothing but darkness. He kept walking, but the sound came again, closer this time. It was like a light scratching on a tree trunk, so small but enough to send a chill down his spine. David started running. He had no idea where he was running, but his survival instinct urged him to escape whatever was chasing him. His footsteps echoed in the absolute silence, and every time he thought he had escaped the sound, it came back, clearer and clearer. Finally, when David was almost exhausted, he saw a faint light in the distance, flickering in the dark forest. He felt a glimmer of hope, thinking that maybe this was the way out. Without hesitation, he ran towards the light. As he got closer, David realized it was the light from a house, but not just any house. This house looked eerily familiar. It was the windowless house he had escaped from not long ago, now appearing before his eyes like a never-ending nightmare. He stopped, gasping for breath, filled with panic. How had he gotten back here? This couldn't be happening. David felt like he was lost in a vicious circle, a nightmare he couldn't escape. The door to the house opened slowly, without a sound. David didn't want to go in, but he couldn't turn back either. Some invisible force was pulling him toward the house. He tried to resist, but it was useless. The more he resisted, the closer his steps were to the threshold. As David stepped through the threshold, everything became blurry. There was no longer the thick darkness outside or the feeling of fear that had gripped him. Instead, an eerie silence enveloped everything. He was standing in the middle of an empty room, with nothing but a large mirror in front of him. David looked into the mirror, but he did not see his own reflection. Instead, the image in the mirror was another room, the room he had first entered, and standing in the middle of it was a man with a pale face, hollow eyes still empty. The man looked at David through the mirror, not moving, not speaking. And then, slowly, a faint smile appeared on his lips, a smile not of joy, but of defiance. A chill ran down David's spine as he realized what was happening. He was no longer an observer. He was now a part of this terrifying game. David tried to move, but he could not. His entire body was frozen, as if the shadows that had been hovering before had now taken over him completely. He could only stand there, staring at the mirror, where the image of the other man gradually faded away, giving way to another shadow. This time, the shadow in the mirror was no longer a stranger, it was David. The windowless house had chosen a new soul to imprison, and David? He was now a part of it, a soul lost in space and time, never able to escape this invisible trap. It seemed like the end for David, but the house never stopped. It still waited for other unfortunate people, like a trap that silently existed in the dark, calling for lost souls. People often heard about haunted houses, places where souls could not rest, but no one knew that this house not only haunted those who entered, but also dragged them into another space, unable to return. A few months after David's disappearance, another group of people were accidentally led to the mysterious forest. The story of the windowless house was forgotten, sinking into the past along with rumors and unsolved mysteries. This group included 3 close friends, Alex, Emily, and Mike, who loved to explore mysterious places to record in their discovery videos. "We'll be famous for this one, if we find anything weird," Mike said, half joking, as he led the group through the dense forest paths. "As long as we don't run into anything really scary," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice calm despite the uneasiness she'd felt since the start of the trip. Alex was silent, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He wasn't superstitious, but the feeling that something was watching them from the moment they entered the woods made him uneasy. As the group walked deeper into the forest, they began to notice a strange change in the scenery. The sky turned gray, and the air around them seemed to thicken, making each breath heavier. Suddenly, Emily saw a faint light in the distance, like the light from a house. "Look," Emily exclaimed, pointing towards the light. "Maybe it's somewhere we can rest." Without thinking much, the group began to walk towards the light, not realizing that they were following the footsteps of those who had disappeared earlier. As they got closer, the windowless house gradually came into view. Just like the ghost stories people often heard, the house stood silently in the middle of the forest, no signs of life, no sound. Mike chuckled. "Here it is, a perfect location for a new video. Let's go in and see what's inside." Emily hesitated, and Alex felt a sense of dread begin to rise in his heart. "I'm not sure. This house looks wrong." "We're here already. Aren't we going back halfway?" Mike shrugged and walked over to open the door. As the door opened, a cold wind blew through, carrying with it the musty smell of time. It was dark inside, but it didn't seem scary at all. The three of them stepped inside, carefully feeling their way across the old floor. Mike turned on his flashlight, the flickering light sweeping across the bare walls. "I don't think there's anything here," Mike said, sounding a little disappointed. "Just an old abandoned house." But as they turned to leave, the door behind them slammed shut with a sudden thud. Alex rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, his voice starting to crack. Suddenly, the air inside the house became suffocating. Emily felt her chest tighten, and Mike looked around silently, his gaze slowly changing from confidence to fear. The house seemed to come alive, as if it had realized that there were new visitors. Mike's flashlight began to flicker, then went out. In the absolute darkness, the three of them heard a soft laugh from the end of the room. A hoarse laugh, not coming from any of them. "What the hell is going on?" Emily gasped, trying to see around in the darkness. Alex tried to keep his composure, but a cold shiver ran down his spine as a blurry figure began to emerge from the dark corners of the room. It was a person, or rather, something that wasn't quite human. Mike blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but as the shadow moved, it became clearer. A tall figure, pale-faced with empty black eyes, just like the stories David had told before. The figure slowly advanced towards them, and before anyone could react, that soft laugh rang out again, echoing through the room like a sound from another world. Everything blurred, space distorted, and time seemed to stop. Mike was the first to scream, rushing to try to open the door again, but to no avail. No one can escape the presence that surrounds them. The house not only holds David, but it also attracts three more souls, trapped forever in a vicious cycle of fear and despair. The story of the Windowless House has become an unofficial warning to anyone who dares to venture into the mysterious forest. Locals around the area often recount whispers and strange figures they see when the sun goes down. But no one dares to go too close, and the curious, if any, only know about the house through stories or short videos that Mike's team recorded before it disappeared forever. However, mysterious stories always attract those who love to explore, and this is no exception for Peter's team, a famous paranormal investigator on the internet. After watching Mike's team's last blurry videos, Peter decided to go to the scene himself. Peter has many years of experience exploring places that are considered haunted. He believes that most ghost stories can be explained by science or psychological phenomena. For him, the Windowless House is just another problem that needs to be solved. Peter was joined by his two longtime colleagues, Julia and Ben. Julia was a psychologist with a passion for studying phenomena related to the human mind. Ben, on the other hand, was a seasoned videographer who filmed their investigations for Peter's channel. "We've seen too many so-called haunted houses, but they were all just pranks or misunderstandings," Peter said as the three of them entered the woods. "This house will be no different." Julia was silent, but she didn't seem entirely certain. Ben, as usual, was excited and curious. His camera began recording as the group left the car, stepping into the dark woods. The daylight began to fade as they went deeper, and darkness gradually took over the space around them. "This doesn't feel like the last time," Julia whispered. "The air here seems heavier." Peter chuckled. "It's just the dense trees and darkness that make it feel that way. Don't worry too much." But even Peter couldn't deny that something was different as they approached the house. This time, the house appeared before them, without any lights to guide them, unlike in Mike's group's video. The house was still the same, no windows, just a dark mass standing in the middle of the forest. An uneasy feeling began to engulf the group, and even Ben, who was usually the most confident, hesitated a bit as he approached. "We should be careful," Julia said, her eyes never leaving the house. Peter nodded, but he continued walking forward. As the group approached the door, it opened once again, as if it had been waiting for them. No one said a word as they entered, but they all felt that something was wrong. Ben turned on his flashlight, illuminating the space inside. Everything was quiet, as if the house had been abandoned for a long time. But the air inside seemed thicker, as if something invisible was surrounding them. Peter stepped forward, raising his hand to signal Ben to start filming. Welcome to another of our investigations. Today, we're going to explore a mysterious house that many people believe is haunted. Peter's words were cut off as the door behind them slammed shut. Ben turned quickly, trying to open the door, but it was locked, just like what had happened to Mike's group. "Don't worry, it's just a gust of wind," Peter said, trying to reassure everyone, but his voice was broken. Julia stood still, feeling the cold air spread through the house. She tried to stay calm, but there was a slight sound from behind her, a soft chuckle, just like what Mike's group had heard. The group froze. The hoarse laughter rang out again, as if toying with their fear. Peter felt his throat dry, but he managed to say, "Who's there?" "We're just here to investigate, not to hurt anyone." There was no answer, only darkness. And then, from the darkness, a shadowy figure emerged, the same tall, pale-faced, dark-eyed figure. Julia began to breathe heavily, and Ben backed away, the camera in his hand shaking. "We need to get out of here," Julia whispered, but no one seemed to hear. The shadow drew closer, and this time, it didn't stop. Every step it took caused the space around it to distort. Peter, Julia, and Ben were trapped in a terrifying loop, unable to escape, just like the ones before them. The windowless house once again held the souls who had accidentally entered it. Its curse never stops, and those who dare to step foot in it never return. As the group stood frozen, the shadow approached, fear covering them like a heavy blanket. Peter, for all his confidence, felt a cold sweat run down his spine. Julia backed away, and Ben held on to the camera, as if it were his only salvation at the moment. The shadow stopped in front of them, seemingly examining each of them. Its deep eyes were like to endless black holes, sucking in the surrounding light. Peter gulped, feeling as if every scientific theory he had ever believed in was now shattered. This wasn't a joke or a psychological phenomenon. This was something else entirely, something inexplicable. "We have to get out," Julia shouted, her voice echoing throughout the house. But as she turned to leave, a cold wind blew past, extinguishing Ben's flashlight. The room was suddenly plunged into darkness, and the cackling laughter rang out again, this time closer and clearer. "Hold on," Peter shouted, while everyone tried to find the light from the phone again. But when the weak light of the screen was released, the blackness disappeared. They were trapped in a cruel psychological game. "Get out," Ben shouted, running towards the door, but it was still tightly shut. They began to panic, trying to find a way out. Julia remembered that Mike and his group had talked about a small window at the back of the house. Maybe they could find an exit through there. "To the window," Julia instructed, and the group quickly moved through the moldy walls. They ran fast, the light from the phone was weak, but every step felt like something was following them, like invisible shadows. Finally, they reached the small window that Julia had mentioned. But when they tried to open it, they found it was locked. Ben knocked frantically on the window, but only received an empty sound. The light from the phone screen illuminated their faces, making them look like frightened ghosts. "We can't stay here any longer," Peter cried, but despair seemed to overwhelm them all. Then, for a moment, there was another sound, a sound like a heartbeat pounding, relentless. They turned and saw the shadow again, now closer, its eyes blazing like fire. "Run," Julia shouted, and without hesitation, they started running again. But this time, there was no way out. The front door was gone, and the house seemed to be shrinking, the pressure increasing. The shadow was getting closer, and now they had no choice but to face it. "Why?" Peter shouted, unable to keep his composure. "We don't want to hurt you." And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke, soft but menacing. "You are not the first to come here. You will be like the others, who have been trapped in this darkness forever." Julia knelt down while Ben continued to hold the camera, recording the final moment. "We cannot give up," he shouted, as if to give them all strength. The shadow seemed to stop, strange shapes surrounding it. "You chose this path," it said, And now you must pay the price. In the final moment, Peter felt a weight on his heart, as if everything had come to an end. He didn't want to be part of this legend, didn't want to be trapped forever in the windowless house. But it was too late. Then, a bright light burst from Ben's camera, causing the shadow to retreat. "Run!" Peter screamed again, and like magic, the front door opened. They rushed outside, the light of day a precious gift. But when they looked back, the house was gone, as if it had never existed. Only a dark forest remained. The next day, the videos from Ben's camera were released, but no one could explain what they had seen. The story of the windowless house spread again, but no one knew the true fate of Peter, Julia, and Ben. They became part of the rumors like the others before them. The windowless house remained, waiting in the darkness, until a new group came and were drawn into the never-ending curse.